Sunday, assalamu alaikum, peace and blessings, peace and blessings. I am Dr. Aisha El-Amin, and it is my joy and privilege to welcome you to the fourth Sunday Joint Taleem between Masjid Al-Taqwa and the Ifrin Baha Center. We have some really great conversations planned today in a presentation. I want to give an opportunity. I don't know if I see a few folks from the Baha Center. I don't know if Imam Omar or one of his Imam staff are available just to give the salams. You can put in the chat. We can also, at the end, have an opportunity so that you can address the believers as well. And then we have Imam Tariq El-Amin to give the salams as well. And we'll have him do that at the end as well. So as you all know, we have Taleem every Sunday, and our fourth Sunday is our joint Taleem. We will be recording, and we also have this in our Taleems from the past, as well as our khutbahs on our YouTube channel, Masjid Al-Taqwa. So if you have not subscribed already, please do so, so that you can get the wealth of knowledge, wisdom, and information that we've been blessed with our presenters. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing to you Luke Sullivan. He's been the religious organizer at Arise Chicago since 2012. And as a religious organizer, he builds support for clergy and congregations for Arise Chicago's union and non-union worker campaigns, public policy campaigns, and to support Arise's fundraising efforts. So Luke coordinates Arise's annual labor in the pulpit in the Membar program, which places speakers in over 100 services over Labor Day weekend and distinguishes Arise as the program's national leader. And he's pursuing his graduate degree in nonprofit management and is associate with the Congregation of St. Joseph. And Luke is also fluent in both English and Spanish. So we have the honor, and I know Imam Tariq has worked with you and speaks so highly of you, Luke, and has promised not to heckle you today. And so we are, generally we allow the presentation, and I ask the believers, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. You can also raise your hand, and we'll leave the last 15-20 minutes for reflections, questions, and more discussion. So Luke, without further ado, please take it over.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. El-Amin, and thank you all so much for allowing me to speak with you this afternoon. I am going to share my screen for a brief presentation, if you'll allow me, and then to go over a little bit about the history of Arise. There's a photo of Imam Tariq that I got that will show you all about him in action with us. And then also some policy campaigns we are working on. And then a question for how is it that you can support us at Arise, support our worker members, and support our policy campaigns as we move forward. So I'm going to share my screen now, and I will do that. Okay, can everybody see that?
Yep, you're good.
Okay, perfect. So before we start, I wanted to give a brief intro into Arise Chicago, I know there's a lot of text here, but I just want to give a brief history of Arise Chicago. So Arise Chicago was founded in 1991 by 3 religious leaders. And the idea behind it was they were looking at what was happening in the world. They were looking at what was happening in Chicago in the 1980s. They saw what Reaganomics, trickle-down economics was doing to workers, how unions were being dismantled, and said, this isn't just an economic issue, but this is a moral issue. And as people of faith, as faith communities, we have a moral obligation to stand in solidarity with workers who are fighting for a better life. And originally, it was working with unionized workers, workers going for a first contract, a fair contract, workers on strike, religious leaders joining delegations to CEOs in union negotiation meetings, a lot of what we called faith labor solidarity work. And as it says here, Arise Chicago was one of the first of such of these organizations in the country. And then in 1996, there was a spinoff organization that said, we need to bring this model to other locations throughout the country. And when we were started, there was maybe 3 or 4 such organizations, and now there's over 250, what we call worker centers throughout the country. And a lot of this is because as unionization rates were going down, 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 our organization said, how is it that we can support not just workers who have a contract, but those who do not? And often those are the most perilous types of jobs that exist. And so we opened up what we called a worker center. And we work with low-wage, non-union, mostly immigrant workers. And as it says here, most of our worker members are from Central and South America, as well as Poland. And the biggest issue that our members face is something that we call wage theft, which is basically the underpayment and non-payment of wages. So as it says here too, in Cook County, we did a study with UIC, labor education program, and in Cook County, every week, $7.3 million is stolen from low-wage workers, over $1 million a day. And nationally, it's about $50 billion a year is stolen from workers. And so you can imagine what happens if $7.3 million went back into the pockets of low-wage workers, what that would do for their families, for our communities, and for the economy. And so while that's the biggest issue we see, we also partner with congregations working together with workers. And I like to think of the worker center along a spectrum of the education to the organizing to the policy changes. And education is obviously critical because so many people who come to Arise Chicago either think they don't have any rights or think they have rights that they don't have, because back where they were from, they were guaranteed certain rights that do not exist in our country. Federal holidays, that does not exist. Extra pay does not exist in the United States, except for certain areas nationally. Paid time off does not exist. Paid sick days does not exist. And so education is critical to know what our your rights are, not just so that we can only fight for what we have now, but where are we moving forward, but it's critical to know your rights. And so often too, what happens is workers will come to Arise Chicago, go through a workshop and say, I don't want to go through a workshop. I know my last check bounced. That's all I want to fight for. But then, oh, you mean overtime is time and a half? Oh, you mean I shouldn't have to pay for uniforms? Oh, this, oh, that. And suddenly $3,000 becomes $30,000. And obviously for the last 2.5 years, health and safety has been a very big issue. As laws changed about essential workers and non-essential workers and what was allowed, what was not allowed, things changed so quickly that education was critical. And then we moved from education to organizing. And that means, okay, I know what's happening. I know that wages are being stolen. What do I do about it? So that was where, how do you talk to your coworkers? How do you talk to your community members? How do you engage your religious community? How do you engage area religious communities in support for your campaign? And so often it's religious delegations in your area. It's engaging religious leaders in your neighborhood to go with you, to walk with you, to stand with you. And that bringing that moral voice is just so essential. And then that leads toward, okay, we could go from workplace to workplace to workplace to workplace until the cows come home. How do we make systemic changes? And that's where our policy campaigns. And as it mentions here, organizing thousands of workers to negotiate better working conditions. We've also passed 7 pro-worker laws in the last 10 years. And we're currently working on a statewide law called the Secure Jobs Act, which is how do we make jobs more secure? How do we make jobs more stable in the state of Illinois? And then we're working on a few other campaigns as well, but that's our big campaign that we're working on now. So I think of it as education to organizing to policy changes. And underneath all of that is the support of the religious community, the foundation of the religious community, because that's who founded us. That's part of our DNA and that's who we are. And I've been here for 10 years and I can't tell you how many times I've seen having that moral voice is just so essential to bringing about justice. It's just so critical, is having the religious community be the concentric circle in support of the workers and our worker members. And as I begin, I want to start with one of our programs that Dr. Elmi mentioned is something called Labor in the Minbar. And in 2020, Imam Tariq gave a brief reflection about worker rights. And so I wanted to play that for you now. I hope my sound quality is going to be okay. It's about 2 or 3 minutes long. And so to hear from him about worker rights and about through our Labor in the Minbar program. So I'm going to play this for you now. Let me know if you can hear it.
Assalamu alaikum. May the peace that only God can give be upon you. I'm Imam of Masjid al-Taqwa on Chicago's South Side. I wanted to take this opportunity to draw your attention, our attention, on this upcoming Labor Day weekend, to those who continue to work in unsafe conditions, those who continue to work not receiving a livable wage, in addition to the millions of others who have been displaced from their work. But I wanted to focus in on them and ask that we keep these folk in mind during this time of pandemic, this time where the inequality, the inequities have all been made larger and more visible during this time. And we know those distinctions fall, unfortunately, along class lines. They fall along racial lines. So we have more Black and brown folks who are falling into those categories of being underemployed, meaning they have to work multiple jobs because they are not receiving a living wage. And during this time that they are more susceptible to the transmission of the COVID, to the coronavirus. That being said, I applaud the work and I ask for you to continue to support the work of Arise Chicago as it continues to educate and to advocate on behalf of workers seeking that livable wage, seeking protections for their health and their well-being during this very difficult time. So yes, it is Labor Day coming up. It is not a traditional Labor Day, right? It's not a time where we're just going out and having those cookouts like we would have normally had. This is a time where we really get to think about what it really means. And if we're going to show appreciation and show some protection for the backbone of our society, then this is the time for us to do it now and to keep them in mind. I pray for the continued well-being of you and your families. I pray for the continued well-being and protection of all those who are working, now those who are working and who are not receiving their due. Let's do everything that we can to ensure a living wage. Let's do everything that we can to ensure the safety of those who are most vulnerable among us. And with that, I wish you and your families a happy Labor Day. And once again, continue to pray for those who are on that front line and who have limited capacity to advocate for themselves. And thank you once again, Arise Chicago, for the great work that you continue to do. Assalamu alaikum. May the peace that only God can give be upon you.
I think that's a beautiful reflection. And we work very closely with Scott Foundation and with Khalil Demir, and we did a presentation and he helped me craft some of the language here talking about rights of workers under Islam. And what I was so struck by 10 years ago when I started this job was how similar the teaching is of all of our faith traditions that existed in very different parts of the world and it began at very different time periods, all believe in essence the exact same thing about the treatment of workers, the dignity of work, living wages. And I thought to myself, you know, if this is the reality of our faith teachings, then there's probably something to this, and just how important workers' rights has been throughout the centuries, throughout the millennia, for all of our faith traditions. And that really, really struck me. And to me is why I've been around for the last 10 years doing this work, and why it's so important that we all continue to support workers and we all continue to understand the reality of workers. And, you know, Imam Tariq gave that presentation in August of 2020, and it's now almost August of 2022. And it feels like that reflection is as relevant as ever, unfortunately. And so we have to continue in mind the rights and dignity of workers, especially those essential workers, and what the reality is for our economy and how our economy has been created by exploitation of workers. And so, as many of you probably know, the current reality for labor around the country, especially workers, is the idea of exploitation of workers, and the system that our economy has created is dependent upon exploiting workers, especially around exploiting foreign workers. And here are just some of the realities that workers face. And talk about punishing formation of unions. It is a billion-dollar industry created with, and we have worked against tons of these sort of companies that make billions and billions of dollars preventing workers from fighting for a better life. And it's amazing to me how often I see companies and organizations say they don't have enough money to pay their workers, and yet they have enough money to pay consultants thousands upon thousands of dollars every day to prevent workers from organizing. And as it says here, exploitation of labor of foreign workers and immigrant workers are some of the most exploited workers in our economy. And gender inequality that exists. The income inequality is at the greatest that it's been since the 1920s, which is sort of an eerie sign about what's coming, that this is the reality of our economy and then of our country. Unsafe working conditions, again, the reality of this pandemic. Who has it impacted? Where were people getting COVID? Where are people getting COVID? You know, people aren't getting COVID at the beach. They're getting COVID at the workplace. And we didn't have protocols in place to prevent the transmission of COVID, and thus the deaths that existed because of COVID. We are working with a group of workers at Rush Hospital, and they have told us what it was like transferring people who died from COVID from the hospital to the morgue, and then what it was like transferring their coworkers, how many coworkers they had to bring down to the morgue. And they were offered a 15-cent raise. And just how shameful that is, and how shameful that reality currently is, not just at Rush Hospital, but all over the country. And so our work is teaching us that all work has dignity, and therefore no one should have to die at the workplace. No one should fear that they will die at the workplace. And unfortunately, that was the reality. We worked with workers at El Milagro, which make tortillas. And at the beginning of the pandemic, in April of 2020, 80 workers got COVID and 5 workers died from COVID. And just the shame that exists from that, and yet our economy depends on that. And so why is it that workers that we deemed essential and that we called heroes are those that are paid the least with no access to healthcare? That's the reality of our economy, and that's what we're working to change. And as Imam Tarek said, workers of color, and talk about the most lethal pre-existing conditions of COVID, racism and income inequality, and how workers are putting themselves in danger every day to support the economy, to support us. And too many of them do so without living wages, without healthcare, proper safety, proper protocols. And why is it that those that are deemed most essential, that have, hero signs made of them, are some of the most exploited, and currently are the most exploited workers? Rush Hospital had this big sign about how the workers are the heroes, and yet they offer them only a 15-cent raise when they've made billions and billions of dollars from TIF money and others. But that's where the religious community comes in. That's where you all come in, is bringing in that moral voice to support workers organizing, sharing that, yes, what you're doing is right, what you're doing is just, and that we support you. And again, I've seen time and time again just how important that is. And so we're grateful for all of your support in this. And so this picture, you'll probably recognize the person speaking at the microphone. This was taken in January 4th. We held a press conference outside a construction building of apartments at the 1-year anniversary of a worker who died on the job. His name was Yaroslav Zuk, who was a Ukrainian immigrant who came here looking for work and found work at a non-union construction company. And there were all sorts of health and safety violations on the job. Didn't have proper safety equipment, no helmets. And while he was working about 4 or 5 stories up on the building, he fell headfirst into a dumpster and suffered injuries, was rushed to the hospital, and then died a few days later. And there's just such symbolism of someone dying in a dumpster, and just what the company thought of him. And yet, as people of faith, we know that this person deserved better than dying as refuse, right? construction was needed, proper health and safety equipment was needed to prevent that worker from dying on the job. And so we have a candle of him at our office right now, commemorating him, commemorating all workers who have died on the job, whether from disease, whether from illness, whether from health and safety violations. I talked with other people as well who was working on the job, was a mother, had 2 kids. I talked to her husband, and she got sick from COVID and was rushed to the hospital and died a few days later with 2 young kids. And just these stories time and time again happen, and is still happening, and shows just how important the workplace is. And this press conference was an interfaith press conference. We had a United Methodist pastor. We had a missionary Baptist pastor. We had sisters. We had priests. We had brothers. We had everybody there showing imams that this worker had dignity, and that our faiths teach that these workers had dignity. And I think it's just a powerful reminder of the role that the faith community plays in support of workers. And so we talked a little bit about workers coming to Arise Chicago, and I want to give a brief overview of workers who come to Arise. Why is it that workers come to Arise? In what situations do they come to Arise? And how do we respond? And so I think they come to Arise recently in about 4 categories. One, those who were recently fired or recently quit. What often happens is, obviously, approaching an employer is really, really intimidating and really, really hard. And so what often happens is people say, you know what, my last check bounced, I'm fed up, I can't take this anymore, I'm going to quit, and then I'm going to contact Arise. And so we work a lot with them to try to receive their back wages, to try to fix the health and safety conditions that are happening on the job. But that is a very prevalent one. They come to our education workshops, explain what happened, and we'll do delegations. We'll work with the Department of Labor. We'll work with communities, all sorts of different spectrums to get their money back. And we've just recovered a couple $1,000s last week from a group of workers in Pilsen who were being underpaid and not paid proper vacation time. Workers who want to quit or fear they will be fired. And this happens often is workers are afraid to speak up on the job. We did a study again with a group of about 1,000 workers, showing that the biggest thing that prohibited them from organizing was fear of retaliation and fear of losing their job. And so this is a big, difficult thing for workers to get over, is how I want to speak up, I want to change the situation, but I'm afraid that my employer will fire me. And our laws are labor laws are so woeful that it's very, very difficult to prove discrimination. And there's only a few categories of discrimination. And so later I'll talk about a bill that we're working on that would change this reality. That's called the Secure Jobs Act. And this is, again, one of the reasons why we feel like it's so important, because we've seen the thing that stopped workers from organizing time and time again was fear of retaliation. Another thing that often happens is a recent accident happened at workplace. Usually in the last 2.5 years, it was workers got COVID, someone died from COVID, and they said, my job is not worth it. I'm walking off the job. I'm taking action on the job because I'm not going to risk my life working at this company who doesn't respect me. And a lot of that was, again, in the last 2.5 years, was workers who, whether it's COVID outbreak at the workplace, but it also deals with construction workers, all sorts of different spectrum. We worked with Portillo's workers at El Milagro, where work conditions were just so inhumane and just so terrible. El Milagro, for example, they were forcing workers to work double the pace. We're not giving them a day off in conditions that were over 100 degrees. And so workers were fainting, workers were dehydrated, workers were getting sick on the job because of the awful conditions. They said not anymore. And then the last one was want to know what to do after a group of workers took action. And that's what happened at El Milagro. That's happened at Portillo's. And we get groups of workers doing that as well, saying, okay, we're all doing this together. Then they call Arise and say, what do we do? Which is great and hard in the same time. But again, we always say that, protected considered activity, which is doing something as a group, it's so much better in so many ways. The laws protect you more. You're more protected because you do it as a group. And so that's what we always recommend is doing something, which is acting together, two or more workers together. And then how is it that Arise responds to these workers? How is it that and especially, again, this is more and more relevant over the last 2.5 years. How is it when workers come to us, what do we do? And I mentioned before, we want workers to go through a 2-hour training or a workshop. And again, as I mentioned before, people say, I really don't want that. Why do I have to do it? And again, because it's never just one thing, and it's never just one worker. It's always, always, always multiple issues that happen. And we want to know the real situations that are happening at the job in order to work with these workers to solve the problems that are happening at this workplace. Not just one of the issues, and then we say, okay, we'll see you in 6 months when it happens to you again. But we want to say, how do we create that change at the workplace to stop these issues from happening? And as I mentioned here, after the workshop, how do we advise workers about staying safe on the job? This was, again, more and more relevant the last 2 years. What to do if they feel their life is at risk. Create petitions, gather signatures. Again, that protected conservative activity, delivering letters to management. This is where the faith community comes in as well. We've, for example, Portillo's, their headquarters is in Oak Brook. And a couple of summers ago, when it was just awful conditions at the workplace, we had religious leaders joining workers in Oak Brook at their headquarters saying, we demand you meet with us, we demand you pay us better. And then what to do if you're let go or you're fired. How do you know if it's retaliation? How do you know if it's not retaliation? How do you know if you qualify for unemployment benefits? How do you approach your employer about health and safety conditions? Again, some of the issues that our members face, food and shelter. What do they do if they feel like they've gotten COVID? What do they do if a coworker has gotten COVID? All of these issues that we see time and time and time again. And again, we think it's really imperative that we have that education down of what are your rights on the job, and then how do you go about fighting for those rights? And, a lot of people ask if we are attorneys, if we work with attorneys, and I am not an attorney. No one at Arise is an attorney, but we have what we call a legal advisory board. And while we do work with attorneys, and there are some cases such as injuries at the job, workers' compensation, immigration issues that come up, I think sometimes what happens is working with an attorney or going to the government agency, while important at times, it's such a move that takes the power away from the workers. And we want workers to take the control of their own destiny, take power into their own hands. And I've seen, again, time and time again, it's faster. The workers become leaders that then give presentations and workshops saying why this is so important. And then they recoup money, changing conditions faster. And so to me, it's just so important having that, what we call a direct response, because we see it's essential. It works faster, workers become leaders, and we do press conferences, such as we did with Yaroslav Zluk. We have press conferences, and June 30th, we had a press conference in our office talking about checking your check with the raise in the minimum wage. We have press conference with workers who walked off the job, workers who are fighting for better conditions on the job, raising awareness in the media. Because what often happens too is people say, oh, I'm afraid to speak up because if I just keep my head down, if people don't know what's happening, then they're not going to do anything to me. But the problem with that is that if no one knows the situation, often it's easier to exploit workers. And so the more well-known, it's sort of the opposite of what most people think. The more well-known the situation is, the more public you are about it, the harder it is for people to retaliate against you because it's so well known and so out there. And so everyone knows the situation at Portillo's or El Milagro or wherever it might be because it's been a public and it's out there. Versus if it wasn't, it'd be so much easier to exploit workers, take advantage of them, and have no one know about it. And this is, again, a lot of where the education comes in and the direct response comes in and why we think it's so important. And then, as I mentioned, we move from the education to the organizing, to the policy changes. And one of the policies we're working on is something called the Secure Jobs Act. And we did a study with 1,000 Illinois workers with a Heart Research Institute. And as it says here, 68% of workers reported they or a coworker worked while sick or injured to avoid being fired. Nearly half of all Black workers were unjustly fired. And then, 1 in 3 Latinx workers were unjustly fired. 71% of fired workers had to borrow money or take out money on credit cards to pay bills, and then depleted all their savings. 50% could not pay their bills on time. And in essence, it's because of this power imbalance that exists between employers and workers. And because of that imbalance, the employer inevitably has more power. And this prevents the workers from organizing because they're afraid of retaliation. And as the laws exist now, it's very, very difficult to prove discrimination, and there's only a small number of categories that exist. And so right now, anyone can be fired for no reason or practically any reason. And so what happens if you want to fire someone, technically there's laws of discrimination around your race, ethnicity, creed, sexual orientation, but okay, I'm going to fire you because you're Jewish or because you're Catholic or because you're Muslim, but I'm going to say, I'm going to fire you because of poor performance. And how do you prove what the real reason is? And it's very, very difficult, very, very time consuming. And who do you think wins most of these cases? A low wage worker or an employer, right? There's that inevitable imbalance. And so that's why we're working on this act. And here is some of the policies that it does. And it requires, again, I look at it as a right to know. You have a right to know, I have a right to know, we all have a right to know why we're being terminated. Because it makes it so that an employer can't just fire you for any reason. An employer can fire you, don't get me wrong, it's not preventing that from happening, but it's making it so that you have to prove why you're doing it. Again, a right to know. And our brothers and sisters in unions who have contracts already have this labor protection. In the 1960s, when unionization rates were 1 in 3 workers, 1 in 3 workers had this protection. So it's not like this is some new concept that has never existed, that no one has ever had ever. This is part of the contracts that people sign who are in unions or who have some sort of agreement with their employer. This is just making it so that it exists for all workers, for all of our members. And then it mentions some of the issues that face. And one of the things that also that's, what happens is employers will basically make work so terrible for their employees that they quit. They reduce their hours, demotions, create a hostile working environment, unfair work environment, all those sort of things. And then part of it here is also talking about the fifth one about electronic monitoring. Amazon has patented technology which basically measures your heart rate. And so it can say, oh, your heart rate is 60 beats per minute. You must not be working hard enough. Oh, your heartbeat is X per minute. Okay, you're working hard enough. And so they're using these draconian policies to basically fire workers or terminate workers. And this is basically preventing that sort of thing. Now, is it preventing cameras from being used at the workplace when necessary? Of course not. But it's basically preventing these sort of awful draconian policies that companies are using to fire workers. And then there's some other parts as well. You would have file a complaint with the Department of Labor. But again, to me, it's you have a right to know why you're being terminated. And this law helps address that situation. And so the other thing we're working on is something with the rights of domestic workers in Chicago and in all of Illinois. So in the 1930s, when basic labor laws were passed, when FDR was trying to get the Southern Democrats on board to pass what was known as the National Labor Relations Act, 2 groups of workers were excluded: farm workers and domestic workers. And the reason they were excluded was obviously the racism, the laws dripping with racism. And what we are part of a coalition that was working to basically allow domestic workers to fold in domestic workers to the National Labor Relations Act that covers all other employees. And so this is minimum wage, anti-sexual harassment protections, overtime, all the other policies that cover basically every other worker. And we were to pass this in 2015 in the state of Illinois after a 4-year campaign. And then we are working in Chicago with employees and employers of domestic workers, say, okay, how can we continue to improve working conditions for our domestic workers? And so the city of Chicago passed a law that basically guarantees that all workers must have a contract with their employer in the city of Chicago. And their minimum wage goes up to the minimum wage that covers all other workers. And so this is really important because so much domestic work is what we would call in the shadows, is verbal agreements that exist. But we treat you like family and all this and all that. Yeah, but if an injury happens or something happens on the job, these are where contracts are so important. And so we do a lot of education with employers. We do a lot of education with domestic workers around what are your rights in the job, why we think this is beneficial for both employers and employees, why it's mutually beneficial. Here are things you can do depending on the situation. You can have this type of contract, you can have that type of contract, whatever it might be, whether it works with an agency, an individual, all sorts of different things. So that's something also that we're working on, and we're happy to do a separate presentation on the rights of domestic workers for employees and employers, why we think it's so important. And then just to end, I talked about the Secure Jobs Act. That's something that we're really interested in working on. I did a presentation earlier today with a Lutheran church on the north side, trying to meet with our state representative, Robin Gable, to say this is why this bill is so important. And one of the other representatives that we're working to try to meet with is Representative Curtis Tarver II, who is the state rep that covers Masjid al-Taqwa. And so we would love if you all would be willing, we can do a separate presentation on this, or if you all would be willing to join us at a meeting with him. Usually they're on Zoom. We have the author of the bill there. I'm usually there. Public Policy Director at Arise is there, talking about why this is important. We need people who live, work, or worship in these districts as part of these meetings to just show your support for the bill. And this just talks a little bit about why it's so important working with congregations, why it's so important working with allies in support of our worker members, because people cannot do it alone. We need support. We need congregation partnerships, relationships. We need allies to support this. And it lists here some of what I've seen as to the most important, why it's so important to have congregations as a part of it. Again, that moral authority, showing that this is a moral issue, moral support for workers who are doing something very, very brave. And then also how can we help build the organization? How do we help build these policies that support workers throughout Chicago, throughout the ward, throughout the district, throughout the county, throughout the state, and throughout the country. And then list some of the ways that congregations have supported us. We have a mailing list, task force for congregations, such as meeting with the state rep or meeting about different policies and other things. So I know that was about 35 minutes. So thank you for bearing with me. I hope that made sense. I hope that was informative. I hope that was interesting. And then now, if people have any questions or comments or reflections, I'd love to hear them. Let me stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much, Luke. You were on mute the whole time. No, I'm just kidding.
I want to start over then. 1991, we were the
So that would be horrible, right? No, that's a lot of great information there. There's a few things in the chat, and I'll read them out loud. And I also wanted to add to them. I'll let Bill go first. And Bill, if you want to, I can read it off, or if you want to add to it. I know you've done a lot of work in this area as well.
Yeah, I think probably the best thing would be to kind of let me make a couple comments about why I asked the question. Well, first of all, I want to thank you so much for being online here with us. This is one of my favorite topics, and I think the work you're doing is just amazing, particularly the policy work. So thank you so much for that. I guess I had two kind of connected questions. One is, as you know, there's a lot of kind of union organizing going on by, groups like the larger unions like SEIU or SME or the Teamsters or whatever, that are trying to organize, various workplaces and that type of thing. I was curious from your description whether you, how do you work with unions like that, or an area that, or a business or something that actually wants to unionize, but also obviously wants to get the rights and that kind of thing that you're pushing for. And then I have a little bit of follow-up to that. But
Yeah, we work with a lot of unions. We work with SEIU. I've been on strike lines a lot with SEIU. The Teamsters, for example, the Rush Hospital workers who we're working with are members of the Teamsters. And so they held a rally there. So we've done religious statements with them. They held a rally where we had religious leaders go out. They're fighting for a contract. And obviously 50 cents an hour is pitiful. So it's going to be a tough negotiation with the union. So a lot of our union work is when they're interested in having that moral voice, that moral authority in support of their campaign. Having the workers there, and then us bringing in that faith perspective. So again, with Rush Hospital, for example, and there's a lot of organizing going on with those unions. And I think you mentioned also Starbucks, Amazon. There's a lot of energy around this, and I think the pandemic has really brought out the gross inequalities that exists, and people are just fed up with it. And the difficulty too is with Starbucks, for example, there's 150 stores that have voted to join a union, but they haven't had a first contract yet. And that's, as you know, that's so difficult. And that's where that community comes in, and where that that religious support can really be helpful. And so that's where we try to do a lot of work, is bringing in that faith component to the work. Whether it's, again, strike lines, doing delegations, things like that. And I think too, the religious community feels a little bit separate, if you will, from union campaigns. Is what it feels like. It's another layer of support for the campaigns, not just the workers, but it's the community, and it's the religious community. It's all these congregations that are coming out to support workers. And so that's what we do, a lot of like faith, labor, solidarity work. So I do a lot of that as well.
And just a real quick follow-up. I supported unions like pretty much forever in that kind of work. And before I became a Muslim, it was mostly from a leftist perspective. And now I'm, a leftist Muslim, if you will. I'm still, very supportive of unions, union organizing. Do you get any, I don't know if I call it pushback or tension from, as you know, some of the unions are definitely more leftist oriented, which doesn't mean they're hostile to religious groups or faith-based groups. But do you pick up any of that in the work that you're doing?
Sometimes we do get that. I think because unionization rates, I think it's like 10% nationally, there's not a lot of people don't have experience with unions. They don't have experience of being in one. They don't have a family member who's in one. And so it leads toward a lot of fear about what it means to be in a union, what they do, what they don't do. Are they just like agents of the Democratic Party? Things like that. There's a lot of misconceptions around it. And it's really hard to break down those barriers when there's just so much unknown, because unionization rates are just so low. And so I think it's just a lot of education, a lot of misinformation, and that's what people do, right? That's why there's anti-union consulting groups that are so popular, is it works. And so it's just doing a ton of education around that. And then the religious communities too, what the history of all these religious communities supporting workers. We always joked that the first unions were religious communities having workers meeting in the church, the church basement, or the basement of the mosque or the synagogue. And that hasn't existed for so long. And so it feels like these groups have been separate for so long. How do we bring them back together in this reality? And so that I think is a big struggle. And sometimes it's difficult to overcome. Sometimes we can do it, and sometimes we can't.
No, very, very good point. There's a comment that it was great information, also very much needed. I see Imam Ramadan came on screen. I don't know if you wanted to make a comment or had a question. You're muted though. So as he
can you hear me?
Yep.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Very good. Okay, I just wanted to express my appreciation for what he brought to us and for the space that you occupy. And by what I mean is that over the years, I projected myself that someone, or at some point, some development would have to occur in that space among people of faith and organizations and religions. Let me explain what I mean. As a child, my father worked in an automobile plant. He was a press operator, and he used to take us as children to his union meetings. And over the years, I appreciated what their concerns were. And they were more concerned about automation coming in and losing jobs, and plants moving to where cheaper labor was, and all. And I really appreciated it, because our family moved just for those reasons. And I began thinking now, with artificial intelligence coming in, automation, robotics coming in, and over time, jobs will be lost. That's the direction, the trajectory is that these good paying middle class jobs are going to be lost over time. So I asked myself, who's going to fill in the difference? Where is the human dignity going to be maintained that comes with working, and the roles that men and women played when they had a household, when income was there? Who's going to fill that space? And it dawned on me that there was no one with the concerns except the religious community. They were going to have to, at some point, rise up when there wasn't enough jobs to go around, especially good paying jobs to come around, that the religious community was going to have to rise up and say, you still have dignity as a human being. This is how we're going to have to make the adjustments with family life and your spiritual life. That was going to be a role for us to rise up and have to fill because of the direction the society was going in. So I didn't see until this moment someone really sincerely occupying the space. And it's going to grow and become more and more important as you go on. You're fighting cases now, as I listen to your reports, and I can understand, but it's going to take on a bigger and bigger role as the number of jobs decreases and the number of people increase. And the role for people of faith and religious communities will become more and more clear, I think, in the future. Thanks for allowing me this a moment to make this comment. Assalamu alaikum.
Alhamdulillah, wa alaikum assalam. And Luke, just to give you a bit of background, Dr. Ramadan is a medical doctor. He's also been the resident imam prior to Imam Tariq for many, many years. So he's beloved, and he keeps us informed on a lot of those things that you were saying about COVID. And we really rely on him. And thank you, Imam Ramadan, for your comments.
Alhamdulillah.
So you talked about workers' rights and a separate workshop that you all give kind of for workers' rights. Could you give us a teaser on some of those things that you found that many people don't know are actually rights that you should know as someone working?
It's interesting. Wages is the biggest thing because I think it's like a tangible thing, and my paycheck bounced. So wages is a biggest issue that we face, that our workers come to us for. But we see like 25 different ways that what we call wage theft happens. And so we teach a lot of our worker members to what we call check your check. Especially with the change in the minimum wage that happened on July 1st. Unfortunately, there's like 18 minimum wages in the state of Illinois, depending on where you live, and it's so confusing. And so that's a big education part, is not where do you live, but where do you work, and where is the work located? And so that's because people say, oh, well, we're located here, but you come from there, therefore it's however many dollars an hour, it's less, because it's in Chicago, but you live in Cicero, that means this, or you live in Arlington Heights or whatever. That overtime is time and a half. That's a big issue that we see a lot of. And in terms of workers who do not have work authorization, there's the fear of, oh, well, I don't have rights. Well, no, when the law was created, that idea didn't exist, right? So because of that, if you work, you have rights on the job, and you don't have all rights, but you have rights on the job. And no matter what, you're entitled to the minimum wage. No matter what, you're entitled to a health and safety conditions at the workplace, no matter what. And so there's a lot of misconceptions around that. There's also a lot of misconceptions of, oh, I work on my religious holiday, so I should be paid extra. Well, no. Oh, I worked on Sunday, I should be paid extra. Well, sure, but that doesn't exist in the law. And so, paid time off, parental leave, all these issues that exist in so many different countries don't exist here. And so just because you work on a holiday of your religious background doesn't mean you should be paid extra, or doesn't mean you have to be paid extra. It really doesn't. Or again, the termination thing. Well, they have to have, I worked there 30 years. They can't just fire me. I have worked there for 30 years. Well, yes, they can. That reality. Oh, I had to take a sick day. Paid sick days now is the law in certain suburbs in Cook County and in city of Chicago, but well, I had to take a day off to take care of my child. Therefore, I'll be paid for that day, right? Well, no, that's not the law. And so all vacation, you do not have a right to a vacation day. No one has the legal right to a vacation day. All of these things that I think are just so taken for granted for a lot of folks, or exist in other places that don't exist here. Those are some big issues that we see. And just, or in the state of Illinois, for example, there's 7 investigators for stolen wages. So you can imagine how big Illinois is, and only have 7 people. What's the probability that someone will get caught? Besides morality, there's really no legal, it's pretty much zero. And so, or I'll file with the Department of Labor and they'll get back to me in a month. It's like, well, they'll get back to you in 2 years. Right. So it's like those type of things too that happen. That's where direct action is so important. So those are some of the big misconceptions that we get. Or I got COVID on the job. Should I be paid for those days? Well, no. So all of those things that there's misconceptions around what you offer, employer can offer, but what is legal. And there's a difference between something that's illegal and something that's unjust. And how do we differentiate those two? Working somewhere for 30 years and being fired is unjust, but it's not illegal, for example.
Well, that's definitely a workshop I think we'll benefit from. I want to honor the chat, and the Cannon family wrote, thank you for sharing this information, and just wondering how you're able to safeguard undocumented workers while also encouraging them to organize and speak up for themselves. That's a balancing act there, I'm sure.
Yeah, and so how we approach this, we don't ask people who come to us what the documentation status is, because in all reality, it doesn't matter. Right? The law is the law is the law is the law. And as a worker, you are obligated to receive from your employer wages, health and safety conditions. If you have papers, if you don't have papers, it doesn't matter. Union organizing is slightly different, but it doesn't matter. And a lot of what happens, this is perhaps a bigger point for the question, is so U visas is if you're a victim of a crime, you can receive a work visa. But it's also called T visas, which is trafficking, and labor trafficking is very, very common. It's one of the more common. It's actually more common than sex trafficking. It's called labor trafficking, and so we do a lot of work with folks who are work and then feel unsafe to leave the job, or they feel like they cannot leave the job, and then you can receive something called a T visa, which is work authorization, not past citizenship, but it's a work authorization. And so we do a lot of work around T visas and U visas with our members, but we never ask documentation status, because it doesn't matter. Whoever you are, wherever you come from, you need to be paid the minimum wage. Case closed, period, sort of thing. So we don't ask about it because it doesn't matter. Therefore, it doesn't impact us really, if that makes sense. Obviously, it impacts, fear and education. I mean, there's so many factors involved with it, don't get me wrong, but for our specific workplace lens, no matter who you are, no matter where you came from, no matter how you got here, you deserve the laws. You deserve, it is legal, it's illegal to treat you differently with the labor laws, but labor laws are also so complicated. So I don't know if that makes sense, but that's how.
That makes complete sense. That makes absolute sense. Thanks for responding to that. In our last 5 minutes together with your wealth of knowledge, I want to open up the floor. If folks had any other questions or comments, feel free to just unmute your mic or put something in the chat or do the raise hand. So, and as soon as I close out, then everyone will start talking, I'm sure. So what I like to do is if there's any other things that are coming up, I know that you told us about the act, and I don't know where it is kind of in the process right now. The ones that you all, I'm sorry about that. Where it is kind of in the process. And I also see Imam Tariq has unmuted his mic as well. I'll give him an opportunity to talk.
Well, you can go ahead. Luke can answer, and then I'll follow up after that.
Sounds good.
So I would say the two biggest things that are coming up. One is about the rights of domestic workers. That's something that we're doing a lot of work on, and so doing with employers and with employees, because it's such a complicated type of work that it's very important to do education around. We're a worker rights organization. We're not into people losing their job, right? If we put out policies and supported policies that would force people to lose their job, that would not be something that we would support, because it would go against our self-interest. And so we want to talk to folks about why these laws are so important, why it's important from the employer and an employee. And so that's, I think, a great topic that we could do a separate presentation on for that perspective. The other one is the Secure Jobs Act. So it is introduced in the House and in the Senate. Senator Carol Ammons, who's in the Champaign area, and then Senator Villanueva, who's on the southwest side of the city. That's her district. Are the two main co-sponsors of the bill. And so it has been introduced. And so basically, in order to get it to be voted on a committee, we need more co-sponsors. And so we've met with, I think we have like 25 of the state reps are the co-sponsors now, but we need more. And one of the folks that we are interested in meeting with is Representative Tarver, who is the state rep who in the Masjid al-Taqwa district. And so again, we want people area, if you would be willing to join us for a Zoom meeting, that's what's really nice about it, is you don't have to travel anywhere. You can do it at work. You can do it from anywhere, but people who live, work, or worship to be a part of our meetings. We're not asking you to know everything about the bill. We're not asking, you'd be experts on it. We have someone who wrote the bill again to be there to answer those sort of technical questions, but we need you to join us and be a part of these meetings to show the support from constituents for this bill. And so that would be something that if people are interested, I'll put my information in, but we would love to have you join us for that. And so maybe if 3 or 4 of you even would be willing to do it, then we can work to get a meeting set. And how it works usually is if 3 or 4 of you be willing to say yes to that, I would work to set up a meeting and say, okay, he's available these dates, these times. Can you make it? And then we would set up a meeting that way and do a prep call and everything. So that's sort of how we normally do it. So that's kind of a little bit overview for that. But those are the 2 main things I think that are coming up soon.
Oh, that sounds great. And I'll get that information so that we can put it out to the believers in our newsletter as well.
Perfect.
Imam Tariq, did you want to have a few closing remarks?
Thank you so much, Dr. Elmi. My brother Luke, I really appreciate the presentation. And for those who don't know, I joined the board of Arise Chicago earlier this year, as a union member, as a believer, as a Muslim. I think the connection is evident, and I just want to. I'm hoping that, because I'm joining by phone, I don't know what the chat is looking like. I'm hoping that we will have some response, some folks who are willing to take part of that meeting with Representative Tarver, and just keep this organization in your dua, and as Dr. Ramadan alluded to earlier, that this organization occupies a very unique and a very needed space as far as where we are right now. So thank you again, Luke. And I kept my word. I kept my heckling to a minimum. Seriously, a great presentation. I really appreciate it. So thank you all. And that's all for me. Assalamu alaikum.
I join you in thanking our dear brother Luke for coming in and sharing all of the information he did around Arise and the work that's going on. I encourage the believers that are on the line and our family at the Baja Center as well to continue to get involved, see how you can help, because this is all of our fight for justice. And so
Dr.
I will
O'Neill?
end with the. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, before you close, I don't know, did Imam Omar make it on?
No, I don't see it.
Okay, all right. I'm back on mute.
Okay. And so I will close by saying we will continue to make du'as for Arise and those folks that are not getting the rights that they deserve in the workplace. And we hope as a family of believers to be part of the justice work that you're doing. And may God protect and guide our feet as we do the work. And thank you again from both the Baja Center and Masjid Al-Taqwa.
It's great to be with all of you. Thank you so much for the opportunity.